Hope everyone's staying cool. I think we have another day of the heat wave, or I don't know if it's technically a heat wave, but another day of nicely warm weather. Okay, we're gonna get started. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We are recording this, as you probably had to accept okay for, and we will post the recording on our YouTube channel sometime in the next few days. Could be as soon as tomorrow if I can get my act together. So welcome to our June meeting. We're going to learn from Brendan Carson about how to use ecological principles to enhance pollinator habitat. Excuse me, and I will be turning it over to him shortly, but first a few reminders, and I will drop links in the chat in it, once he started talking. Our next brown bag lunch is Wednesday, July 3rd, noon to 1. We hope you join us. Everyone is different. They are the conversations that pop up, you don't anticipate, and they're fun. And it's a nice way to sort of meet fellow advocates and get moral support and share projects you're doing and just have a nice chat. Our next monthly meeting for the network is Tuesday, July 30th. And our presentation will be Cultivating a Sustainable Future, Cornell Botanic Gardens Native Lawn with Todd Bittner, which I think should be very exciting. And no, we're not going to have an August meeting. We hope you enjoy your gardens, and then join us again in September when we will hear from Trevor Smith about our future with stormwater and how we can use it to our advantage to benefit our ecosystems. So now on to our presentation. Brendan Carson is a PhD candidate at Tufts. I will let him introduce himself further and teach us how we can enhance pollinator habitat. Brendan, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Glad that you could make it this evening. And yeah, I guess I'll just talk a little bit about my background. So for my master's degree, I studied pollinator conservation at Michigan State University. And now I'm actually working on butterfly disease at Tufts University. So I'm studying a virus that affects, well, I might actually leave it a surprise which butterfly it is because it's in the presentation. But I'm studying how diseases affect butterfly population dynamics. And so I talk a little bit about some of those things, but actually I end up focusing a little bit more on ground nesting bees, because Renee said there is particular interest on that topic in this group. So I dug into some of the scientific literature and tried to present a little bit more about that topic. And as we go, if you have any questions, feel free to bring them up. Probably just putting them in the chat is the best way to go, and then Renee can help moderate. But especially if there's something that I say that doesn't make sense to you, I'd really happy to clarify, because I'm shooting for kind of a medium level of knowledge already. So if anything doesn't make sense, please let me know and I'll clarify. And so I'll go ahead and share my screen and we can get started here. All right, and Renee, is that right?
Looks great.
So as I'm sure a lot of you know, there's all sorts of pollinators. A lot of the time we think about bees and butterflies, but hoverflies, wasps, beetles, all of these do a lot of pollinating services. There's a lot of different bees that are pollinating. So it's really good to think about all different sorts of insects. And then, some mammals are pollinators too, when we talk about pollinator conservation. However, this talk is really going to be focused mostly on bees and a little bit with lepidopterans in the beginning here. So lepidopterans are in Massachusetts, and that's butterflies and moths. So in Massachusetts, we have 120 butterfly species, and we have more moths than that. So there's 3,000 moth species. So a lot of the times, I think pollinator conservation emphasizes butterflies, but really there's way more moth diversity out there. And while some butterflies provide plants with pollination services, for instance, in a study of pollinator networks in Sweden, Ola Jennersten found that while butterfly pollination was of minor importance, these two plant species, Dianthus deltoides and Viscaria vulgaris, were pollinated by butterflies. However, they're typically after nectar. Butterflies are typically after nectar and don't collect pollen on purpose like bees do. In general, butterflies are not thought to be as good at pollination as bees. While moth pollination is very understudied, so this is an area we really don't know a lot about, research suggests that they might play a much larger role in as pollinators than butterflies. Moths tend to have more hair on their bodies than butterflies, and this picks up pollen while moths are sipping nectar. So you can kind of see in all these photos, there's moths that have quite a bit of hair on their bodies, and they're all interacting with the flower close up. All right. Here are, I just want to talk a little bit about habitat for, I'm focusing on butterflies right here, but habitat for lepidopterans in general. And so here are two different butterfly larvae or caterpillars. So on the left, a lot of you probably recognize the monarch caterpillar. Oops. And then on the right, this is the Baltimore checker spot caterpillar. And that's the species that I actually study for my PhD right now. So I use these two species in this talk right now because they kind of have different characteristics in how they use habitat. So, but monarchs, well, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with initiatives to plant milkweed, and it's actually pretty successful because if you plant milkweed across the landscape, monarchs are great at finding it and laying eggs on it. So we have a student at Tufts in our department who did a research project where they planted milkweed in pots and placed them around the Tufts kind of neighborhood and greater Boston area, and found that even just a single plant isolated from other milkweed plants attracted monarchs to it, and the monarchs laid eggs on it. Contrasting that with checker spots have a little bit of a random search pattern, and they don't seem to hone in on their host plants from a distance nearly as well. And as I've been watching them, they tend to just land on any plant in the area and check it out and see whether it has the right chemistry to be a host. So they're not great at identifying plants from a distance. And because of that, their host searching is a little bit random. And this leads to a phenomenon that really means that the way you treat habitat for each would need to be different. So with monarchs, like I said, they're good at finding individual plants. So if you plant monarchs kind of sparsely in the landscape, they should be able to find them and lay eggs. Checker spots, on the other hand, if you have host plants, and so their host plant here is white turtlehead, and if you plant white turtlehead kind of sparsely across the landscape, they're just gonna fly around and probably just fly off without finding it. On the other hand, if you have a high density of host plants in an area, there's a good chance that they're gonna bump into them and lay their eggs. And so if you have enough of them in an area, you can actually sustain a population of checker spots. So you have enough host plant in an area. But again, it needs to be at a fairly high density and encompass a reasonable amount of space. And so these two strategies of these two butterflies, I think, speak to how it's really important to consider the life history and behavioral traits of butterflies. And I would extrapolate this to moths when we're thinking about providing habitat for them. A lot of moths are using trees for their hosts, so a lot of oak trees and maples, a lot of shrubs that we could plant are great for moths. And anyways, I'm not going to talk too much more about butterflies and moths here, but I just wanted to contrast these two behavioral lifestyles to think about how we really don't know for most species the patch size that needs to be planted in order to support them. So we know something like monarchs, you don't need a lot, but I think a lot of other lepidopterans are going to need a pretty big patch of their host plant.
Brendan, we have a question. How much
Oh, sure.
how much space for turtlehead plants is helpful for checker spots?
That's a great question. So it I've seen populations of them in the wild that are existing on probably like a quarter acre of habitat. And within that quarter acre, there's a few patches of turtlehead that are maybe 15 feet in diameter. So if there's enough that they're gonna be able to reproduce on it and support quite a few caterpillars on those plants, and then have those plants still be viable when the adults come back and feed on them and lay their eggs on them, then that could do a good job. But to be honest, I think checker spots are a species that might be tricky to really get to exist in an urban habitat well. So I see these as kind of two ends of a spectrum, monarchs on one end and checker spots on the other end. This is a question I'm really fascinated by, and I think, to be honest, we just don't know the answer very well right now. But yeah, that's a good question. All right, so this is a phylogeny of angiosperms, or kind of a tree of life of angiosperms, the green, so flowering plants, and then lepidopterans, so moths on the right. And this is showing that these two groups of organisms, flowering plants and moths, have a very long tied lineage. And we think that they evolved together, and they've been evolving together all the way back to some of the best evidence is kind of the early Triassic. And then you can see, this is just kind of interesting. Can you see, Renee, can you see my mouse when I move it around?
Yes.
Yeah, so this group right here in the orange, so these are butterflies. So just kind of from an evolutionary standpoint, it's kind of interesting to look at this because these are all groups of moths, and then butterflies evolved out of moths, and they're really kind of nested within a clade of moths. So you can really think of butterflies as daytime moths that are really specialized on flying during the day. Now, there's other differences too, but that's a good way to think about it. Now, I bring this up as a nice, let's see. Okay, yeah, so 160,000 described moth species in the world. I think I said 3,000 for Massachusetts. And there's definitely a lot more than 160,000. We just haven't described a lot of them. About 18,000 butterflies. So again, there's a lot in the world, but their diversity isn't nearly as high as moths. And about 250,000 angiosperm species. So I think it's kind of interesting. They're in the range of a one-to-one relationship. It's not exactly, but if you add butterflies and moths up, it's in the same order of magnitude, which I think is kind of interesting. But then there's another pollinator that came onto the scene a lot later in evolutionary history, but has had a huge influence on plant evolution. And those are bees. So bees essentially are a type of wasp that evolves to use pollen as a resource. So they're like vegetarian wasps. And they came onto the scene. I'm gonna go back. What's that? It was in the Cretaceous, so about 140 million years ago. And bees since then have really evolved a very wide array of lifestyles, and they use all sorts of different plants. Some of them are kind of generalists and use a lot of different plant species, and others are specialists and will only use either a few or plants within one family, or some will only use one plant to gather pollen and nectar from. So how many bees are in Massachusetts? We've got about 400 bee species in Massachusetts, about 4,000 bee species in the US, and there's about 20,000 bees on our planet. And again, those are probably underestimates because those are really how many have actually been described. Here's some of the families of bees we have, or different groups of bees. So bumblebees, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, honeybees. These green metallic sweat bees you see a lot. If you look, this one's on a cone flower. They really like these echinacea flowers. Cellophane bees. Oh, sorry, these are longhorn bees, mason bees, leafcutter bees, cellophane bees, cuckoo bees. So these are ones that actually lay their eggs in the nests of other bees, and carpenter bees. So we've got a lot of different types. This is a very kind of abbreviated list here, but these are some of the main groups. And then within this, yeah, so the photos above, all those bees were on flowers. So they're representative of where we usually see bees, but most of their lives are not spent flying around in search of flowers. So where are bees spending the rest of their lives, the majority of their lives? Solitary bees, a lot of them are in stems, in the ground, in dead logs or pre-existing cavities. Bumblebees are making small colonies. Their nests are often underground, but they can actually be above ground in kind of tussocks of grass. And then honeybees, of course, are really big colonies and typically are either in managed hives or in cavities in trees. Again, honeybees are not native, but they do provide a lot of pollination services. So here's just some photos of those places. So again, so we see bees when they're flying around looking for flowers, but really they spend a lot of their time. This is a ground nesting bee, and a lot of the rest of our talk is going to be about ground nesting bees. But they really spend most of their lives, probably about 75 to 80% of their lives, underground. So this in order is a female bee. This is the stage where she's excavating a net. So she's digging in the dirt, making these chambers. You can't really see it in this picture, in this drawing, but she lines the chambers with a film that helps protect it. And we actually don't understand a lot about what that's doing, but we think it helps maintain the right humidity or moisture content and probably prevents pathogens from coming in. And as she's doing this, she's out collecting pollen, making some pollen provision, and then she'll lay an egg on that pollen, and then she'll seal off that chamber. And that egg hatches into a larva, and that larva looks like just a little worm, and it eats this pollen, grows and grows. And then at this point, this doesn't actually have the seasons on it, but around here, this larva would be close to full grown in most species, close to full grown by the end of the summer, early fall. And then at that point, it pupates, just like butterflies go through metamorphosis, make cocoons. Bees pupate, and it looks like a fully formed adult bee here, but it still is in development on the inside, and they go through the winter usually in this pupal stage. And then in the spring, or whenever that particular species, whenever its kind of life history kind of detail or causes it to emerge. So some might emerge in the spring, but others are going to emerge in the summer. Some might actually wait until early fall to emerge as adults. They're going to dig out, they'll kind of go through this and dig back out. And this oftentimes will have collapsed. So they might actually have to dig through all of this soil to get to the surface. And then they'll mate. And the cycle will kind of resume. So for most of this, they're underground, either eating their pollen or pupating and developing or overwintering, or underground because they're actually working on the nest. So they spend a lot of their lives, if they're ground nesting bee, underground. Of course, other bees nest in stems, and we actually think about stem nesting bees a lot when we're thinking about bee habitat. Actually, I just want to show this picture too, because this previous picture just shows these two chambers. A lot of bees have these pretty elaborate underground burrows that have many offspring in them. So they have different passages going off to different chambers. All right, so this is just kind of a point that we don't know a lot about bee nesting behavior. So although 20,000 or more species of bees exist in the world, nests of relatively few have been found and described. Even among the species that have been described, it often happens that characteristics which one would especially like to know have not been recorded. This is by Michener, 1964. And I found a recent publication, so this is from 2020, Alexander Harmon Threat, who's a fairly young bee ecologist who is doing a lot of work on bee nesting behavior. And so this is a review in which Alexandra took, she surveyed the literature and kind of compiled the results. So I'm going to walk you through what she did and kind of what the takeaways from this that we have are. So her study was a random selection of 527 or 20% of the bees from this bison federal database. Bison it's not referring to the mammal, it stands for biologic biodiversity in service of our nation. It's a federally maintains biodiversity database. And so of these, she just randomly selected 20%. Kind of the idea is to do this randomly. So hopefully the information that she gleans from this, we can look at as an overview and kind of a summary of what's actually out there. So then she searched literature for each species and collected available information about nesting habits of each species. And so of that, for these 527 species, she was only able to find nesting information for 135 or 26% of those. And of those, 83% seem to nest below ground. So even though we spent a lot of time studying above ground or twig nesting, stem nesting bees, 83% maybe, like if we take this as representative of the whole of all bee diversity in North America, 83% seem to nest below ground. And like I said, there's a strong bias towards studying above ground nesting species. And really, this is mostly because it's easier. So you can see, I'm sure a lot of you have seen bee hotels, which are just a piece of wood with a lot of holes in it, or pieces of I think it's probably bamboo or reed, but any kind of tube, and bees will go in there and make their nests. So on the bottom, you can see all of the chambers that this bee made. These stem nesting bees go in, they put their pollen in, and then rather than having it be a dug tunnel, it's this, in a twig or a stem, and then they'll lay their egg, seal it off, make the next one, and etc. And those are really easy to study because you can put them up and then you can just open the twigs and count and figure out what's going on. But for a ground nesting bee, you really have to excavate the nest and dig it up if you want to see what's going on down there. And that's hard, and it's actually, it can be destructive. So it's kind of this catch-22 of we want to know more, but it's hard to sample without being destructive. But we are learning a lot more about them. All right, so what is known? So this again is from this review still. So average depths seem to range from about 9 to 23 centimeters. So about this, somewhere in here. But they can be a lot deeper than that. And implications of this is that deeper nests are more buffered from temperature extremes and surface level disturbance. But 23 centimeters still is not terribly deep. So the cell lining, like I mentioned before, oh, I was going to put a photo in here. Forgot that. So cell linings, we think were a key evolutionary development that allowed bees to take advantage of a lot of different nesting habitats. So you can imagine this allowed them to diversify and take advantage of soils with different moisture levels, and also allowed them to kind of come out of the soil and start using stems. Oh, so I didn't say this, but ground nesting is believed to be the kind of the ancestral nesting strategy. So and it kind of makes sense if most of the bees are ground nesters, that's kind of their ancestral state. And then the ones we see nesting above ground in twigs are ones that have kind of come up with a different strategy. And this using cell lining, and they'll either use plant material, or a lot of them have kind of a silk-like secretion that they can line their cells with. Yeah, I think it's probably mostly about moisture. Also, pathogens can repel parasitoids like wasps or bee flies, but it's not really well studied. We don't know that very well. Okay, soil types. So we have data, again, going back like of all of those 5,000, or no, it's 528 species that Alexandra looked for information on. She found data on soil type for only 48 of those. So we know about soil for a fairly small amount of the bees that are out there. But we know that soil texture can affect water content. So if it's sandy versus clay, clay is going to retain water a lot more. Sandy soil is going to let water go through a lot more and dry out faster. So, and also probably be better at allowing oxygen to get in. And they're going to have different, they're going to affect temperature regulation a little bit differently too. So in this review study, in this about 75% of the bees were in sandy or sandy loam soils. So this is suggesting that sand is probably a better substrate than clay. However, there are exceptions to this, and some species actually prefer clay. And so I think probably you're picking up on it's hard to generalize too much when we're talking about this. And I'll talk a little bit more about kind of what my take on using this information for conservation is. But here I think one of it is to try and maintain natural areas with the diversity of soil types in the landscape. So we don't want to only focus on conserving sandy habitats, because we know that there are some species that prefer more clay-like soils. And there's a lot of plants that like clay-like soils too, and there's probably bees that specialize on those plants. So I think I tend to look at the landscape as kind of a maybe a kaleidoscope of different soil types, and trying to preserve swaths of many different soil types is important. So I also think there's possibly an observation bias here. So sandy soils often lead to less vegetation cover, making it easier to observe nesting bees. And it's a little bit hard to tell whether we're seeing bees in sandy soils more because they're easier to observe, or because that's actually what they often prefer to use. And then kind of another step here is that in general, bare ground is often correlated with higher densities of ground nesting bees. But for the same reason, it's similar to sort out, or it's difficult to sort out how much of this is just from an observation bias. So do we just see them because the ground is bare and it's easy to see them there, or are there more bees using the bare ground? Because you could imagine, if there's dense vegetation, that the roots of plants and all of the stems make it harder for them to actually dig down into the soil. And if plant roots are growing too densely, they could probably grow right through some of those tunnels and in chambers that bees are actually down there developing in. So that's data from this review that was looking at many studies. And here's an experiment. This was done in France, and they actually planted in an array a number of different soil. So these things in the foreground, these are essentially sandboxes, but then they introduced different soil textures to these. So they would either be all sand, sand, half clay, and then kind of a different mixture of loams. And so this was a way to experimentally get at, well, are the bees in this area preferring sand versus clay, or something in between? And then the back, you can see they actually also have above ground nesting substrates. So here, so they had 126 squares, 14 sites, each of which had 9 squares. And I'm not actually going to read all of that. But the key here is that soil texture did not affect the species richness nor the abundance. So even though, oh shoot, I'm going to have to go back. I'm probably not sharing now, am I?
No.
Okay.
We see it. Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Yeah, so even though if you just look at the literature of what people have reported, there's a pretty strong bias to sandy soil being the kind of stronger predictor of how many bees are going to be there. This experiment didn't really show that. So this is showing that the clay texture didn't have a big effect. And then they also found 37 soil nesting bee species and then 21 above ground nesting species. So this is also sort of in contrast to the 81% of bees in the literature review being soil nesters. Now, this is only one region, so I think you can't really extrapolate these results too much. But it is interesting to compare these experimental results to the more survey-based results. Okay, now I'm going to share some info. This is essentially a study that was done by our lab. I didn't actually work on this, but this is done by our lab, and they were looking at bumblebee nesting at a trustees of reservations properties. So this was at Appleton Farms up by Ipswich. And so I'll just quickly describe bumblebee life cycle. So the queen establishes a new colony each spring, and they can nest underground in trees and tufts of grass on the surface, or basically wherever a queen can find a cavity. But not much has been known about where bumblebees nest in the past, because it's kind of hard to find bumblebee nests. Because of the cryptic nature of the nests, they can be hard to find, so we're trying to develop methods to find them to monitor the colony's development. So I'm just going to show some data from this study. So a former graduate student in Elizabeth Crone's lab at Tufts went out. This is Jennifer Pujesic, and she went out and used a few tricks to watch bumblebee behavior, especially for queens that were searching for nest sites, and then worker behavior. When a worker bee, bumblebee, is kind of flying vertically up and down, that's a pretty good indication that they're either entering or leaving a nest, whereas the rest of the time they're kind of going more horizontally. And so she used this method to locate nests and then determine what habitat type they were in, and then where the nests were. Were they above ground? Were they below ground? Or somewhere kind of in the vegetation? Ooh. And so here, these are different bumblebee species: Bombus griseocollis, Bombus impatiens, Bombus bimaculatus, Bombus perplexus, and Bombus vagans. And you can see, so on the left, Bombus griseocollis actually really specializes on a surface or surface nesting. So they tend to be found in tussocks of grass. So imagine grass growing up in a clump. They'll often be kind of right in this area. And they have smaller nests in general, smaller colony sizes, so they can kind of all squeeze in there. Bombus impatiens, which have much larger nest colony sizes, are almost exclusively below ground. Same with Bombus vagans. And then these two, mostly underground, but Bombus perplexus, they found in a few tree stumps. Bombus bimaculatus, they're finding a little bit on the surface. And just in terms of habitat, overall, it seems like meadow was the habitat type that they're finding the most bumblebee nests in. These two species were actually in forests a little bit too. And this one, Bombus perplexus, was the only one found in a hayfield. And it actually looks like hayfields are a fairly high proportion of their habitat. And so just thinking about bumblebee conservation, I think one takeaway from this is some of these. So Bombus impatiens is kind of everywhere and a very successful species. These other species are a little bit less common. And if we look at their nesting types, they're mostly going underground still, but especially Bombus grisecollis is above ground. So if you want to do habitat management for species like grisecollis, then you should think about making sure you're not mowing grassy patches during the first half of the summer when these bees are really active. Second half of the summer, this species is actually not as active. So if you wanted to manage an area using mowing, you could strategize when the timing of mowing for Bombus grisecollis. All right, now I'm going to talk a little bit about this other bee species. So this is a ground nester squash bees. They're really cute. Probably a lot of you are familiar with this. We have Peponapus pruinosa around here, but there's a couple other squash bees across the country. And this species actually evolved with squash, which actually we think came up from Central America and Mexico. And so as humans were moving squash plants around, this bee actually, we think, followed and kind of it had a range expansion that coincided with the movement of squash. So similar to that first underground nesting lifestyle of kind of a generalized ground nesting bee, they are spending most of their lives underground. And then they emerge for a fairly short amount of time. So they're out flying, mating on the squash flowers, and then collecting pollen and provisioning their nest the rest of that time. And then they're back underground as larvae. And the adults don't survive past a year. That's something I didn't say before, but for most of these species, the adults are only alive for a small window of time, and then once they've laid eggs and gotten provisions for their larvae, then the adults tend to die. So if we think about conservation, this is kind of a similar figure to the other one I showed, so I won't. So here's that nest lining. So this species actually has a gland that secretes the nest lining here. So squash are a big agricultural crop, and we grow squash and using, in a lot of cases, kind of conventional agricultural tools, including tilling. And so if you think about tilling the soil, unless the bees have their nests really quite far down, tilling can be quite destructive to ground nesting bees. And so there's a lot of reasons to practice no-till farming. So that sequesters carbon a lot better and can prevent runoff and soil erosion. I have an animation. No. All right. There were going to be at the bottom of the screen a bunch of ground nesting bees. They're not there. But anyways, no-till farming can be great for preserving ground nesting bees because they spend so much of their time underground. And so this is kind of talking about farming at a fairly large scale. A lot of smaller scale organic farms do practice no-till farming. And actually some conventional farms also use no-till. So it's not something that's exclusively done by kind of small, more progressive, like kind of organic farm farmers, but can be done at a larger scale. And it also, if you think about an analogy in your backyard, if you use a rototiller, it's going to have kind of a similar effect. It's probably not going as deep as some of the commercial plows, but it would be a good idea if you're concerned about ground nesting bee conservation on your property to, if you need to till, don't till your whole yard up. Probably most of you aren't doing that anyways, but if your garden is one of the biggest areas with available soil that bees can nest in, it'd be a good idea to try to till it in patches or strips rather than all at one time in 1 year. All right, finally, I'm going to show one more kind of data paper. So this is a paper that was looking at a variety of farms, I think mostly in California, where there were wildflower plantings next to farm fields, or the control for this would be just bare soil. And they were looking at soil nesting bee emergence. So the way you do that is you take a big mesh cage and you just put it in random locations on the ground. And as soil nesting bees emerge after they have overwintered, when they emerge as new adults, they're going to be trapped, and you can go and quantify how many nests or how many bees were nesting in a given area. And so here they found pretty good, I would say like pretty convincing results, that these wildflower strips are, so not only are they providing nectar and pollen, but they're also providing nest habitat. So on the left, this is just density of nests, so nests per meter squared. You can see the green dots are in the wildflower plantings, the yellow dots are in the control. And then on the right, this is richness, so the number of species of bees that are in each. So you can see there's many more species that are using the wildflower planting strips than the control strips. So I think a takeaway from this is that wildflower planting strips probably are, we know that they're good for providing food resources, but they're probably pretty good at providing nesting resources too. And so I guess in cases where the plants are super densely grown, maybe it'll be harder for bees to penetrate and make their nests there, but it seems like they are good overall at providing nesting habitat. Oh, there's what I wanted to come. Oh, one last data paper. So another study, this was actually Alexander Harmon Threat. This was the same person that did the review I talked about earlier. And this was her student, Nicholas Anderson. And so they essentially studied the development and survival of bees, soil nesting bees that were exposed to realistic concentrations of what is this? This is a neonicotinoid, imidacloprid. I'm not very good at saying those. But it's a pesticide that's pretty commonly used. And so now we're discovering that pesticides tend to accumulate in soils because they don't break down that fast. And they found in this study that realistic soil concentrations of this pesticide had a pretty detrimental impact on development of a few solitary bee species. So pesticides, again, we know they're bad for a lot of reasons. I actually think we can't use a blanket statement because they can be really important for food production, but they can have detrimental effects on bees and other pollinators and other insects. And so this is just some evidence that they can potentially negatively impact ground nesting bees just from being in contact while they're in the ground. And so I think probably a lot of you are wondering, well, what do we know? And I've tried to give you an overview of what is known about ground nesting bees. Unfortunately, this is an area that we don't know a lot about. So I can tell you kind of some generalizations, but there's also a lot of diversity of lifestyles in ground nesting bees, so we can't generalize that much. And so anyways, to help with that, there's this project, Ground Nesting Bees on iNaturalist. And essentially this is just trying to gather iNaturalist sightings of ground nesting bees that include photographs of their nests. So here's examples of recent observations. You can see all of these are ground nesting bees and the nests. And so I think they're trying to get photos that we can identify the species, or at least the genus. And then a big part of this is to also, once we have this, you can think of it as spatial data, you can overlay where all of these nests are found and overlay it with soil maps and habitat maps, and get a much better picture of where ground nesting bees actually seem to be nesting. And this is a way to collect a lot of useful data. I will say again, this has the bias of it's a lot easier to see bees on sandy or bare soils. So I think this study also has some bias in it. But I will say if you use iNaturalist already, and want to partake in this would be a really fun thing to do, and you'd be helping collect important data. And you could potentially even try and find areas that aren't bare ground and see if you can find bees that are nesting there. Okay. I'm gonna close. Oh, I'm realizing I probably couldn't see that screen. Let me.
We couldn't.
Oh, geez, yeah. Well, at the end, I'll go back to it. Because I can share just that. Okay, so a few things that you can do, and these are kind of my recommendations just based on what we do know in the literature. So avoid pesticides when possible. If you need pesticides to control something like Japanese beetle outbreaks, try and be sparing with them, and don't just spray them everywhere. Avoid mulch when possible. So again, mulch can be a really great tool for gardening, but we do know that the ground nesting bees have a hard time going through a lot of woody debris on the surface of a garden. So if you can avoid mulching when possible, that would help with nesting habitat. Leave patches untilled in your yard space. Think about the habitat matrix. So I think about this a lot of the time at the landscape scale. So all of the different types of habitat, it's really good to preserve as many types as you can and kind of create connectivity. So if you know that your yard has a few different soil types in it, maybe try and leave patches of all of those accessible to ground nesting bees. And especially for things like bumblebees, leaving bunch grasses about a foot above ground can be really useful. And I'm actually going to skip that because I see we only have 10
We
minutes.
do have a question. Is leaf mold difficult habitat for bees?
Leaf mulch.
Well, it says mold. Maybe it was a.
Oh, I
Amy,
wonder.
if you wanna,
Yeah,
Amy,
that
if you
might.
wanna come off mute, if I'm saying this incorrectly. Okay, maybe we can save that for the end. But Amy, just in the end, if you do want to ask this question, since I think I'm not reading it correctly.
Yeah. Let's see. So we've got 10 minutes left. I don't know. There was one other thing I was going to share, but I also want to leave plenty of room for questions or kind of dialogue if we want to do that.
I would say, leaf mold as mulch. Is leaf mold as mulch difficult habitat for bees?
Okay, so I'm imagining kind of composted leaves that are partially broken down when you say leaf mold. I would say that okay, yeah, so I would say if you're putting it maybe an inch or two, I would imagine bees are going to be able to get through that. if you think about a forest floor, there are plenty of ground nesting bees in a forest, and a lot of time there is leaf debris in the forest. So I think that's actually a great solution for this. Let's see another one here. Please comment on nest boxes, bee hotels, and how to maintain them. That's a good question. So yeah, so again, that's for stem nesting bees, which are also super important, and there are a lot of them. So I think a couple of things with those. If you it's not too hard, and you can actually just purchase them pre-made. I'll actually show you. I have one here that I haven't put out yet, but let's see. It's not focusing. Oh, it's really trying to focus on my face, huh? Okay. Um, interesting. Okay, so you can see these are kind of wooden straws or reed. There's some wood that has holes drilled in it. And there's crevices of all different sizes here. And so part of the idea, so this wood is helping hold that in place, but it also provides larger crevices. But it's not helpful. Okay, I'm gonna hold still. And so the idea is that bees are able to go in and make their pollen provisions, lay their eggs, and then they'll make a chamber, and they'll keep doing that. And so I would say that if you want to make one of these, it's pretty easy. You just need to find wood or reeds or bamboo, or you can just drill holes in wood, and you want to give it a depth of maybe 10 inches or so to go back. And yeah, it's not too hard to actually make something like this. In terms of where to put it, just anywhere around flowering plants. But bees actually will travel pretty far between their nests and floral, like kind of flowers where they're foraging. So you could actually put it anywhere, and I bet bees will find it. They're probably more likely to find if you put it near their garden. And then the final thing I'll say is that pathogens can build up in these over time. So I would recommend not leaving the same tubes out for more than 2 years in a row. So try and switch them out every 2 years to avoid pathogen or parasite buildup.
Is there a way to clean them, or do you just throw them out after 2
I
years?
would say, I mean, after 2 years, they're going to be kind of moldy and start to decompose. I mean, if you really wanted to, you could probably soak it in bleach water and in like a 10% bleach solution, and that would kill anything that was in there. But they're also, like, when the bees are going in, they're bringing a lot of debris in with them, so it's probably going to be hard to actually clean out well.
Okay. We did have another question. What to do when wasps are nesting in the underside of your windows?
Oh, I'm definitely not not an authority on that. But I depending on what kind of wasp they are and how brave you're feeling, like, you honestly, if it was me, and especially if you, I hope you don't hate this, Renee, but I'm not above spraying them if it's somewhere where, like, if it's somewhere where you're walking by a lot and you're really scared of them, then that's like the best way to remove them. I don't think you can actually just go and put them in a bag and take them away. I don't think they would do very well after that. So I would say the best thing to do is to just remain calm around them, and don't bother them. And there's a really good chance they will leave you alone too. But if you really need to get rid of them, you're probably gonna have to try and kill them.
Hi, this is Peggy. I'm sorry. I asked the question is because I have those Anderson crank out windows, And then
Oh, okay.
usually there's a lot, so it's almost like a single wasp. It will make the nest, and I feel guilty because it makes a nest, and then they will they will bring a lot of like a green little I wanted to say a grasshopper.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And then so part of me I really wanted to clean up, but then part of
Yeah.
me I also wanted to let them, do their own things. But
Yeah.
it's really messy, and it's not those nests that's big that you need to remove. So I'm just curious to ask, do you just wait till after the cycle and clean them up, or I've been doing this for almost
Yeah, I don't know
40
if
40
anybody else,
years now.
if anybody else wants to weigh in, I would have to look into what type of wasp it was. It sounds kind of like a mud dauber, maybe. And those, I would need to look into their life cycle. I don't know if they overwinter in their nests like bees do. I suspect they actually overwinter as adults. Because so when they're bringing those grasshoppers or maybe caterpillars, they actually paralyze them and then leave them. So rather than
Leave
bring
the
pollen,
eggs
they'll
in there, I
paralyze them
think.
and then leave them in there with their larva, and then the
I
larvae
think
eat them. So I don't think that they would actually. I guess they could pupate. Yeah. Anyways, I'm sorry. I don't know.
Thank you.
Maybe actually Amy might have had it. Amy, did you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I'm definitely not a WASP expert, and so I don't know if people would approve of this or not, although it avoids using any kind of pesticide. But I've had two kinds of wasps nesting under eaves of my house. One of them has kind of an open nest where you can see all the cells, and it stays very shallow. And those wasps, I was calling them flying puppies to try to relax people in my family. They never sting. But people got nervous because there were so many of them and flying around the table where we eat outside. So I try to do it early in the season before the nests have gotten kind of really well developed. They don't get very big, just 2 or 3 inches across, but I knock them down. I've also sprayed that area just with scented oils and water, and then they don't nest there. And even with paper wasps, which do get aggressive, I saw one nest starting, and just when it was very small, I just knocked it down with a broom handle. So it's not the friendliest thing to do for the wasps, but at least I'm not spraying pesticides around. So
Yeah.
anyway.
That seems pretty reasonable. I was at first when she asked, I was imagining kind of a fully developed net wasp or like paper wasp or bald-faced hornets, and those can be pretty aggressive if you try and mess with them.
Those are scary.
Yeah.
I agree.
Well, everybody, thank you so much for attending. Brendan, thank you for walking us through this. It's such a fascinating topic. It's actually something that we can all talk about at our next brown bag lunch if people want to show up. And I've put the registration link in the chat. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of this beautiful evening. And thanks so much for coming, and we'll see you next time. Brendan, thank you very much.
You're welcome. It was fun talking to you all.
Good night.
Bye-bye.